Hello everyone, and welcome to this webinar for the launch of the Refugees Country Briefing for Rwanda. It's great to see that so many of you could join us here today. This is the fifth and last webinar in this series presenting newly developed Refugees Country Briefings. We of course hope that you'll find today's webinar both interesting and relevant for the work that you're doing at your institutions and in your countries on a daily basis. My name is Erlen, and I'll be the host of today's webinar. I work for Toolkit, the Norwegian NARIC Center responsible for organizing this webinar series. This webinar is presented within the framework of the ARENA Toolkit 3 project, a third cycle Erasmus plus NARIC project. ARENA is a cooperation between NARICs, international organizations, and higher education institutions from across Europe, all working together towards the common goal of enabling access to further studies for refugees, displaced persons, and persons in a refugee-like situation. The project is coordinated by Toolkit. So, we're here today to present the first results of the project, which are 5 refugees country briefings that have been developed for Yemen, Sudan, Palestine, Burundi, and Rwanda. The briefings address the need for updated and relevant information resources and have been developed specially to assist with the assessment of qualifications held by refugees and those in a refugee-like situation. The briefings have been authored by expert credential evaluators from the NARICs of Norway, Italy, and Belgium Flanders, all with extensive experience from the field of recognition. We'll today hear from the author of the briefing for Rwanda. And the briefing has been authored by Kim van Elderen, working for NARIC-Vlaanderen, the NARIC Center of Belgium Flanders. Kim has extensive experience from the field of recognition and has been working as a credential evaluator for several years now. So look forward to hearing more from Kim shortly on the briefing that he's authored for Rwanda. But first, just a few words on the organization of this webinar to make everything run as smoothly as possible today. Shortly after Kim has done his presentation, we'll open up our Q&A session to hear your questions and comments to this topic, but of course to the briefing for Rwanda in particular. So look forward to hearing your thoughts and receiving your questions when we get to the Q&A session later on today. However, we kindly ask you to wait until Kim is done with his presentation before you send us your questions using the Q&A tab visible below. If there are any technical problems occurring along the way, fingers crossed that everything works out well with the video and sound quality, but if not, please let us know using the chat function and we'll do our best to look into it. But I think that's it for me. Let's move on to learn more about evaluating qualifications from Rwanda. So Kim, I'll leave the floor to you now to take us through the briefing.
Hello everyone and welcome to the webinar on Rwanda. So Rwanda can be situated in East Central Africa in the Great Lakes region. So here you can see it. Neighboring countries are Burundi, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Uganda, and Tanzania. And the official name of the country is the Republic of Rwanda. The population is 12,712,431 according to a 2020 estimate, which means it has one of the highest population densities in all of sub-Saharan Africa. Main ethnic groups are Hutu, who account for 85% of the population, Tutsi, who account for about 14% of the population, and Twa Pygmies, who account for about 1% of the population. And main spoken languages are Kinyarwanda, English, and French. If we look back at the history of Rwanda, it's interesting to note that Rwanda was already a kingdom in the 16th century, led by a Tutsi monarchy. In the 1890s, it became part of the German protectorate in East Africa until it was occupied by Belgian forces during World War I. And in 1924, it officially became part of the Belgian-administered Rwanda, Urundi, together with their neighboring country, Burundi. Which is where they remained until 1962, when Rwanda and Burundi both each became independent once more. But like in Burundi, the ethnical tensions in Rwanda had been magnified during the colonial period. During the colonial period, both Germany and Belgium had decided to rule Rwanda through the Tutsi royalty and through the Tutsi elite. And as the Tutsi were the minority, if you compare them to the Hutu, this created some frustration. And at the moment of independence, the Party for Hutu Emancipation started rising in power. They quickly overthrew the monarchy, and thousands of Tutsi fled to neighboring countries where they would live as refugees. In 1973, there was a coup d'etat by a Hutu called Juvenal Habyarimana, and he seized power and installed what can only be called a totalitarian regime and a one-party state. And he remained in power until he died in 1994. But already in 1990, the Rwanda Patriotic Front, or the RPF, consisting mainly of Tutsi refugees who had been living abroad, crossed the border and started occupying territory in Rwanda, reaching a stalemate with the Rwandan army, which led to peace negotiations that finally led to the Arusha Peace Agreement and power sharing in 1993. Now, this peace agreement, not everyone was happy with it, and Hutu extremists were incredibly dismayed that the RPF that invaded Rwanda could negotiate at the peace table. So this created a very volatile situation between the different ethnic groups of Rwanda. And the event that made it all go wrong was on the 6th of April in 1994, when the plane of President Habyarimana was shot down by a ground-to-air missile. It's still not very clear who exactly launched this missile, but what happened is that this was the event that set off the Rwandan genocide that would lead to the death of over 500,000 Rwandans in only months' time. And among the genocide, the RPF, or Rwanda Patriotic Front, was able to seize power in all of the country, making them the dominant political party, which they still are up until today. So if we look at the current political situation, we see that Rwanda is now a multi-party presidential republic, with the president being Paul Kagame, who was one of the RPF's leaders. He officially became president in 2003, and he has been taking a lot of efforts to strengthen Rwanda's economy, to strengthen Rwanda's system of education, and he's been bringing a lot of improvements. But there's also been a lot of reports that speak about repressiveness and the persecution of political opponents. And also, normally he could only be president until 2017, according to the Rwandan constitution. But he had it adapted so now he can theoretically stay on as president until 2034. Whoa, something went wrong. Do you still see the presentation? No, something is going very wrong. Okay.
Let's see, Kim. Yes, I don't think we can see the presentation.
So is it gone?
Yes, it looks to be missing. There's only a black screen right now.
Okay, I'll share it again.
See if you can try to share it again.
Okay. You see it again?
Yes.
Okay.
Looks like it's working now.
And we'll continue from there. Then we get to the impact on the system of education. So as is apparent, the 1994 genocide caused massive damage to the educational system. To give some data that you could find, over 65% of all schools in Rwanda were destroyed. A lot of teachers and students were either displaced and killed due to these events. And both the Ministry of Education and the National University were badly damaged, with a lot of their staff killed. But it's also very impressive to see how quickly the system of education could rebuild. Only 2 months after the genocide, primary schools were reopened, with secondary schools quickly following. And since that point, education has been considered a primary investment for the Rwandan economic growth. So some more recent policies are in 2007, the introduction of tuition-free lower secondary education, and in 2012, the introduction of also tuition-free upper secondary education. But it must be noted that tuition-free in Rwanda doesn't mean completely free, as there are still some fees, like, for example, examination fees. There are also some other challenges that remain. There's still a high pupil-teacher ratio, and there are still some double shift systems where 2 class groups have to share the same infrastructure, and there's still a relatively high amount of students dropping out of education or having to redo years. The main responsible body for education in Rwanda is the Ministry of Education, also known as the Mineduc, and they are assisted by several organizations. So, for example, the accreditation bodies are for primary and general secondary education. It's the Rwanda Education Board. And over here, wait, let's see if I can get the pointer here. You see the lists of primary schools, the list of secondary schools. For TVET education, the accreditation organization is the Workforce Development Authority, and they have a list of schools here, and they have a list of schools and even programs here at the Management Information System of the Rwanda Polytechnic School. And for higher education level, it's the Higher Education Council that's responsible for the accreditation of institutions. Which brings us to the accreditation of higher education institutions, or as they usually called in Rwanda, higher learning institutions. And if we look at the public sector, there's only 3 public higher learning institutions left. At this moment, the biggest one is the University of Rwanda, or the UR, and they were founded in 2013 after a merger of all other public higher education institutions. So the National University of Rwanda, the School of Finance and Business, the Kigali Institute of Education, they all merged together into the University of Rwanda. But there were about 6 or 7 that merged into this. There's also Rwanda Polytechnic. They are founded in 2017 after a merger of all public polytechnical schools, and they actually offer TVET education at all educational levels, from primary up until higher education level. But at the primary and secondary level, they operate as an examination council, while at the higher education level, they have campuses, they have integrated polytechnic regional centers offering higher education diplomas and higher education advanced diplomas in every province of the country and in the capital city of Kigali. And the final public higher education institution is the Institute of Legal Practice and Development, and they mainly offer specialization and postgraduate diplomas for students who already obtained law degrees. If you look at the private higher education sector, there are about 37 private higher learning institutions. They account for over 60% of all students in higher education. And you can find the list of recognized private higher learning institutions and their programs through this link from the Higher Education Council. If you look at the most important educational reforms, I guess it would be these 4. And the first one is in 1998. So it's only 4 years after the catastrophic events of the genocide that Rwanda decided to revision how they offered their primary and secondary education. So they introduced state examinations and standardized curricula. And before that, examinations in pre-higher education in Rwanda were concluded by cycles were concluded by school examinations. 2007 saw the introduction of the Rwanda National Qualifications Framework for Higher Education, which laid the groundwork for the system of higher education as it's currently offered in Rwanda. 2008 was more controversial as the language of instruction was changed from French to English. This was announced in late 2008, and implemented in early 2009, giving students and teachers not that much time to prepare. And we've read publications saying that this had an impact on the quality of education. We've also heard applicants who told us that they were taught in English by a teacher who was not able to speak. And already in 2011, they decided that the first 3 years of primary education could once more be taught in Kinyarwanda language. Finally, 2012 saw the introduction of the Rwanda TVET qualification frameworks, setting out a framework with 7 levels of TVET qualifications, TVET level 5 being the equivalent of secondary leaving credentials, TVET level 6 being the equivalent of a higher education diploma, and TVET level 7 being the equivalent of a higher education advanced diploma. So if we go through the education system from primary education up until the PhD level, we start with pre-higher education, of course. And Rwanda has a 6+6 structure for pre-higher education with 6 years of primary education and 6 years of secondary education. Primary education, the first 3 years are taught in Kinyarwanda. After this, the final 3 years are taught in English. And there's a national examination after the 6th year, usually indicated as the P6 year, which leads to the primary leaving certificate upon passing the national examination. And with this, students can access lower secondary education, which has duration of study of 3 years, which leads again to a national examination after the secondary 3-year, leading to an ordinary level certificate of education. And then we get to upper secondary education, where there are 3 different streams. You have general upper secondary education, you have TVET upper secondary education, and you have pedagogical upper secondary education. All 3 of them have a duration of study of 3 years. All 3 of them have a national examination at the final year, the secondary 6-year. So here you can see the qualifications obtained after general upper secondary education. Here you can see the ones obtained after TVET upper secondary education. And here you can see after pedagogical upper secondary education, students obtain a primary teacher education certificate, permitting its students to teach in primary education. So if we look at the documents from general upper secondary education, so these were introduced in 1998 with the state examinations organized by the Rwanda National Examinations Council. And they were offered up until 2012, when the Rwanda National Examinations Council merged into the Rwanda Education Board, along with the curriculum department of the ministry, the inspectorate, and some other divisions of the ministry. And also an important change in the system of education is before 2012, they used programs with their fixed courses. And after 2012, it's hard to read because I added some noise. There's student data printed in the background. They get subject combinations consisting of 3 courses, so they can choose a subject combination of 3 courses that they can freely choose. And then there are 2 obligatory courses, entrepreneurship and general paper. If you look at TVET upper secondary education, we see very similarly, starting 1998, we have the examinations organized by the Rwanda National Examinations Council, and they lead to a professional certificate of secondary education level A2. These work with programs as well, and also after 2012, they still work with programs. But after 2012, TVET general upper secondary leaving examinations were organized by the Workforce Development Authority. Now, if we go to look at access to higher education, the general access requirement in Rwanda is pretty clear. So in general upper secondary education, a student needs to obtain at least 2 principal passes for the Rwanda Advanced Certificate of Education. And TVET and pedagogical upper secondary qualifications can also be accepted. But if you look at admission requirements, higher learning institutions are free to determine their own rules and regulations. We see a lot of diversity. Some institutions just mention the general access requirements and say, do an application and we can see if we can admit you, while others, more specifically the University of Rwanda, they have very specific access admission requirements for every undergraduate program they offer. So, which brings us to the higher education system of education. You can see the secondary leaving credentials here, and they provide access to the undergraduate level. So this is according to the framework for higher education that was introduced. And at the undergraduate level, you have a certificate, a diploma of 2 years, an advanced diploma of 2.5 years. And then there's an ordinary bachelor of 3 years and a bachelor of honors of 4 to 5 years. I have to note that we've been seeing some indications that Rwanda might be shortening the Bachelor of Honors duration. At the admissions page of the University of Rwanda, you can see several 3 years Bachelors of Honors, and there's also an article in the New Times of Rwanda where they speak about University of Rwanda cutting their bachelor programs with 1 year, reducing the duration with 1 year around 2017 in order to save time and money. So we might be seeing more and more 3 years Bachelors of Honors in the future. Most of the bachelors that we've seen from Rwanda up until this day are usually 4 years bachelors. The Bachelor of Honor provide access to the master level or the postgraduate level, where you have the postgraduate certificate, postgraduate diploma, and the master with a duration of 18 to 24 months. And this provides access to the PhD level, which would take at least 3 years. And it's also good to remember that before the tragic event of the 90s, that Rwanda had a system of education that was based on the old Belgian system of education. So what we often see in early 2000s documents is that the terminology is a bit hybrid, that we see that a bachelor degree will be mentioned as bachelor/licence. And the first 2 years on transcripts are sometimes still called the years of the baccalaureate. So in the beginning, there was a bit of hybrid terminology, but after 2010, 2012, most universities switched to only terminology according to this structure. So here again, some example documents. The first one is by the National University of Rwanda. It's still bilingual, degré diplôme, but it was filled in all in English. So some of these would mention bachelor, and then they would say slash, and then they would give the French name licence. This is awarded in 2012, which is the last year that the National University of Rwanda award degrees. In 2013, they merged into the University of Rwanda. So this is an advanced diploma in nursing from the College of Medicine and Health Sciences from the University of Rwanda, which is now one of the only 3 public higher education institutions in Rwanda. Here's an example of a degree from a private higher education institution, Kigali Independent University, previously known as the Université Libre di Kigali. It's a bachelor degree in computer science, second class honors, upper division. And in our case, this is the private university that we encounter the most. Then grading system. So if we look at the grading system in Rwanda at upper secondary education level, it's actually a bit complicated. So this is the system that they currently use in upper secondary education. They have a letter grade A, B, C, D, and E for principal passes, S for a subsidiary pass, and F for a fail. And there's also aggregate points connected to these results. From 2010 until 2012, the S result did not exist yet. So it was A, B, C, D, E, and then immediately F, with A accounting for 5 aggregate points, B for 4, C for 3, etc. And before 2008, there was a completely different system that is explained here. You have A, A minus, B plus, B, B minus, etc. But there's also late degrees of this system will mention an equivalence to what would become the new system. And here is an example of a result slip that we've seen from Rwanda. And it's also interesting to note that these mention a weighted aggregate. You have these aggregate points, and some universities, for example, especially the University of Rwanda, use these to calculate admission. In the country briefing, we've given more explanation on how these are used for calculations, but I'll try to give a short example. So for TVET qualifications, they usually look at the total weighted aggregate, and they will say for this program, TVET students of, for example, accountancy need a total weighted aggregate of at least, and then they will say a number. But in general, upper secondary education, they will look at these course combinations. And for example, for admission to these programs, students need to have principal passes in mathematics and chemistry with a weighted aggregate for those 2 courses of at least 18 or 24. It depends on the faculty. The College of Arts and Social Sciences usually requires 18. The College of Science and Technology usually requires 24. And then you have to remember that these subjects all have a subject weight of 3. So you have to multiply the result by 3. So 3 times 3 would be 9. 9 plus 9 would give these 2 courses together a weight of 18. And also interesting to note that the general paper, the highest obtainable score is S, or a subsidiary pass, or a fail. And University of Rwanda seems to mention that if you fail the general paper, you can be admitted, but you will have to do remedial work. This is the grading system that the University of Rwanda itself uses, and it's just an example because other universities in Rwanda will use different grading scales, but they have a percentage scales. They also use letter grades and grade points. We've noticed some differences from faculty to faculty, which of this information is mentioned. They also have descriptions at the course level. And at the degree level, this is how they calculate whether a student obtains first class honors, second class honors, upper division, lower division, or pass. And here we have some databases that have some really good information on Rwanda. So we have a page from the NARIC network. Our colleagues from Netherlands, from NAFIC, they have a really good country briefing on Rwanda as well. UK NARIC, or now known as Actus, also has some really good information, and I really love this one from Wes. It's very recent, 2019, and it provides really good information, but it's hard to pick a favorite. I would recommend, if you really want to get to the bottom of the system of education of Rwanda, of reading all these publications. Now, I also provided some links to the national education bodies. So here you can find the website of the Ministry of Education, or the Mineduc. Here's the Rwanda Education Board. So they are the examination council for primary education and general secondary education. The Workforce Development Authority, who are now the accreditation organization, and the policy department when it comes to TVET. Rwanda Polytechnic, who have become the examination council for TVET qualifications and also offer the higher education level TVET qualifications, and the Higher Education Council accrediting higher education institutions. And there's also this website that seems to be a general portal having information on all education levels in Rwanda. Now we have some recommendations and best practices. So which language should you be expecting on documents in Rwanda? And usual trend that we see is that until 1998, documents would be issued only in French. Starting 1998, usually documents will be issued bilingually in French and English. Usually they're pre-printed in both languages, and they can be filled in either in French or English or in both. And since 2008, we've noticed that secondary credentials are issued in only English, and higher education qualifications have been following. Some universities made the switch in 2012, some later, some earlier. But after 2008, we've seen Rwandan documents parting away from the French language. Also good to know that there's this document for pre-higher education examinations, because earlier I showed you the certificates that are issued after national exams in pre-higher education, but these usually take about 1 to 2 years to be issued. And that's why students receive these. These are result slips, and they can help students show their results when they haven't received their final certificates yet. But it's also interesting to note that we've seen in the publications that the Rwanda Education Board has been planning to minimize delays since 2017, and they switched printing of final certificates from being documents being printed by a British security printing organization called Smith and Usman to local printing in 2017. So hopefully it will take less and less time to have the final certificates printed. But as we were talking about Smith and Usman before, we know that the pre-higher education qualifications until 2017 were printed by them, and usually credentials by public higher education institutions as well. If you've ever encountered documents by Smith and Usman, you will know that they're one of the most famous security printing firms in the world. So you will also be, if you have a document that's printed by them, you can also expect a lot of security features. So this is a general upper secondary qualification by the Rwandan Education Board. It has UV features, but it will also have a watermark, see-through registers. So in case of doubt, you can always ask for the original. And same with documents by the University of Rwanda, they have the same treatment and also a lot of security features. Also helpful when you have doubts regarding the authenticity is that in Rwanda there are results websites. So the Rwanda Education Board has one for the primary 6, secondary 3, and secondary 6 examinations, and you can find it here. We haven't been able to find one of our applicants in there, but we haven't seen a recent applicant after 2017 yet. And we found an article in which the REB director said that they only added students who had their certificates printed in Rwanda after 2017, and that they hoped that they could in the future add earlier graduates to the list as well. But I've tried it yesterday, and it doesn't seem like they've added earlier graduates yet. It's also the Workforce Development Authority and Rwanda Polytechnic offering level 5 secondary leaving TVET qualifications. They have a similar result checker, but it also only seems to work for recent documents. And it's also good to know that Rwanda has a tradition of graduation books. A lot of universities hand these out to students at their graduation ceremonies, or they can buy them. We've had applicants who had a copy of the graduation book and showed it to us, and it mentions the graduation ceremony, but also the names of everyone who is graduating that moment. And some universities put them on their website. So this is an example by a graduation list from University of Rwanda of November 2019. Another example is Kigali Independent University. We noticed that they were posting annual reports on their website, but we were pleasantly surprised to see that they also have in every annual report, they would mention the names of all students graduating that year. And the last one we were really happy that we could find is something that the National University of Rwanda posted in their final years before being merged into the University of Rwanda. And they posted the graduation list from 1994 until 2012, and you can still access it through this link. Now, for some existing best practices, there's also the European Area of Recognition Manual, providing really good information on the recognition of refugee credentials. There's the recommendation on recognition of refugees qualifications under Lisbon Recognition Convention, and there's the explanatory memorandum. And a really good project that can help with evaluating Rwandan qualifications as well is the EQPR project, where credential evaluators of these NARIC offices were involved in doing interviews with students in refugee camps. And if the interview went well, they would receive the European Qualification Passport for Refugees, providing really good information on their studies based on this interview. So there is a good possibility that you might in the future encounter an applicant from Rwanda who's in a refugee-like situation, who might have one of these EQPR passports, which would be really, really helpful. And finally, there's the toolkit for the recognition of refugees qualifications, where this presentation is based on. So be sure to check out the toolkit as well, and along with the toolkit for all of the other countries for which they were made. And I guess this concludes the presentation for today. So I'm really glad to have had your attention. And if you have any more questions, I'll be really glad to try and answer them as good as possible.